Hello again. Thanks for coming out this evening. I know many of you. My name is Ashley Farrow Murray, and I am, move this down a little bit. I'm the curator of theater and dance here at MPAC, and I also run our talk series where we bring in other thinkers, sometimes scholars, sometimes artists, sometimes both, and everything in between and outside of that, to present on ideas that intersect both what we're doing here at MPAC in our artistic program and also the research that's happening on our campus across the disciplines. So it's a real pleasure as a part of that program this evening to introduce Ashan Crawley, who I think really embodies, was generous enough to kind of hop off of a plane this morning and run right onto the stage and meet with our graduate colloquium, and start to share some of his practice with us. And I think through that hour or two, I was reminded again by how much you really do kind of embody this nexus of theory, praxis, not even putting two things together, but really kind of figuring out where theory is practical and where practice is theoretical. So I'm very excited to hear you share more with us today. I will tell you all that Ashan is an author, a performer, and a painter, which I think we'll see more of tonight, whose work centers around Black Pentecostal spaces. Ashan is an associate professor of religious studies and African American and African studies at the University of Virginia, where he draws both of those fields into discourse on performance and queer theory, with a focus also on sounds and choreographies of Black Pentecostalism. So Ashan's first book, Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, which I just learned will receive an award this week from the Musicological Association, is that right? Was published in 2016 by Fordham University, and examines how the whooping, shouting, noise-making, and speaking in tongues of Black Pentecostalism allows for the emergence of alternative modes of social organization, and again is coming from this hugely performative place. So tonight, Ashan will share with us a little bit of an extension of this inquiry into his new work on a second book project titled The Lonely Letters, which will actually come out this April 2020 from Duke University Press. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Ashan.
I would like to thank Ashley Farrow Murray for the invitation, and I would like to thank the students that I was able to converse with this afternoon at the workshop. Learned a lot, exchanged a lot, had a lot of generative questions, so it was really a lovely time. I want to thank Dorothy Davila, Janelle Marie Fish, and Ian Hamlin for all of the help with the logistics. Logistics are things that are not easy, and people like me sometimes need a lot of hand-holding, and so I'm thankful for the generosity and the care with which they helped me out with logistical information. I'm very happy to be joining you all today. I am very exhausted. I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning in order to get ready to get on a flight. It's my first flight since June or July 1st, and so I also had a lot of anxiety about flying this morning, 2 flights. But thankfully they were non-turbulent flights. I'm exhausted, but it's really the kind of exhaustion that emerges from a kindness and a generosity. So I'm really thankful for the conversations that emerged today. You all have been really kind. And I am in academia primarily, and I don't take kindness for granted because it's not a thing that you can assume. Even when people invite you, sometimes they invite you to not be kind. And so it's really lovely to have experienced the kindness, the conversation. I really appreciate it. Because I'm a little bit tired, I'm going to read as much as possible so it can keep me on task. And I'm going to reset my timer so it can also keep me on time. The title of the talk is Quantum Mechanics, Quantum Sound, Quantum Love, which is from the Lonely Letters Project, which Ashley said will be published in April of 2020. It's a collection of semi-fictional letters about love and loss, about quantum mechanics and sound, about exclusion and imagining a life. This collection occurs through A, person that is based on me, Ashan, and Moth, a composite character of people that I have and have not known, and people that I do not yet know. There's a lot of video, both for me to be able to rest, but also I think to give a sort of context of the things that I'm talking about. So there's a lot of video, but I hope it is useful. And I look forward to the conversation that will, I hope, ensue after the presentation. So everything in the Lonely Letters is written to this person named Moth. It's a failed romantic relationship and a relationship that is trying to figure out how to be friends, how to have a deeply dense Black queer friendship that is not based on coercion or patriarchy or sexism or femphobia. It's trying to figure out a way to actually produce friendship, as Foucault might say, as a way of life. And so A is often struggling because A often feels like he must try to convince Moth that they should be friends and lovers, but through that process also figures out that that's a practice of coercion and that what you need is a non-coercive form of relationality. So they're trying to actually practice that with one another. So I'm gonna read. Dear Moth, what if it were possible to vibrate at the same speed and velocity as our favorite music, as our favorite sound? What if we resonated the way Mahalia Jackson sort of wails and sways and sort of just breathes it out the first time she sings the word soul in How I Got Over? Can we turn it up a little bit? Thank you.
How I got over. How did I make it over? You know my soul back in wonder. How did I make it over? How I made it over. Going on me. You know my soul back in wonder. How did I make it over? Tell me how we got over, Lord. Had a mighty hard time coming over. You know my soul back in wonder. How did we make it over?
Or what if we could resonate the way Twinkie Clark does a Black Pentecostal shout on the Hammond organ at the end of the song, Accept What God Allows?
Don't touch it. Don't hit that note that I like. I'll dance. Don't, Twinkie, you know that note I like. Don't you hit that note. Get off the organ. Please don't hit that note, Twinkie. Y'all want me to hit that note? Hit that note, Twinkie. They want you to hit that note, Twinkie. And we gonna dance. We gonna
How many of y'all in here believe in praise God before you get your blessing?
Or what if we could feel the way Lawrence Lyles does when he changes the tonic center during the end of this song? Can we turn it up a little bit, please? Can we turn it up a little bit, please? I'll control the sound. I can change the sound here. Or the way Jason Sinclair does when he's playing nothing music while the person is talking. What if we could change with one another the way that they move through and in key changes? What if we could just move and tremble and quiver and quake and spin and spin and spin until equilibrium is off and we just slip into the sonic world? That would take a kind of breathing that would be between, that would match in intensity and force what each of us were attempting together. It would necessitate a kind of breathing that is communal and collective, something like what you get when the preacher is hooping and there is an ongoing call and ongoing response. The breathing between preacher and congregation, egging each other on until they're all out of breath. I watched the television show, The Flash, a lot, even though I have to catch up on the episodes. And the show keeps demonstrating that when Barry vibrates at the same speed as what is presumed to be solid and impenetrable matter, that he slips in and into and through the matter itself. Impenetrability, then, meaning a renunciation of openness, a forced enclosure against possibility. So what if we could do the same with music and with sound? To maybe evaporate Evaporation is important because it names something about air and atmosphere, and it also names transformation, change, difference, descent. To evaporate is to be made into that which can be inhaled and exhaled, that which can be breathed. What would we perhaps then evaporate into and be united with it? What then would be our mode of existence? What song or sound would you choose? I would want to choose something that resonates with the simultaneity, spin and quiver and quake and be one with you. Withdraw into you as you withdraw into me. And I know I sent you the picture of that dude, but really I only think about you. Not only, but always certainly you. What kind of sound and vibration could be achieved that even the concept of becoming one would have to be recalibrated? That's what I hear in the songs I sent you. It's kind of mystical. And I've been meaning to ask you about mysticism because you said you went on this silent retreat and it made you think about all kinds of things, that it was this very mystical experience for you. Who are some of the people you would suggest that I read? Moving on. A. Dear Moth, I hear you, I do. I understand that you think I'm not necessarily being fair to mystics, but that's not the case at all. Thanks for sending me the various readings, the Amy Hollywood, the Bernard McGinn, that helped me contextualize a bit more. You're right, and I agree. There is something radical, even though I think the ones I'm discussing do have limitations, and not just because of the times in which they lived. Limitations mean to me that we have to work with and on and against each other in the service of a liberation project, that we have to be engaged in the thicket of the social world, to not retreat from it, if we are going to realize freedom. Iron sharpens iron and all that. I've been thinking about what Rebecca Chopp says, quote, from codes of purity to acts of Jesus' healing, the implicit theological assumption has equated perfect bodies with wholeness of the spirit, and as if to ensure the quest for purity, physical afflictions become elevated to virtuous suffering when and only when they can be spoken of as trials of obedience, end quote. I guess I'm thinking about this again because I'm also thinking about Teresa of Avila and Julia of Norwich and how their experiences of physical pain and torture constitute one way to think about mystical experience. Think about the way Julian of Norwich opens her discussion of mysticism with this, quote, I asked for 3 graces of God's gift. The first was vivid perception of Christ's passion. The second was bodily sickness. And the third was for God to give me 3 wounds, end quote. What I'm thinking about is the way perfect or perhaps normative bodies have to be the grounds from which the desire for physical affliction, bodily sickness, and wounding to occur. One would have to consider oneself as already whole, as in need of something sensate to occur that is non-normative, that we might perhaps call queer, that is different than what the so-called or so-thought normal person experiences. To desire affliction in the body is an individuated thing. It does not connect to all that is, but connects oneself to a greater sense of self. It seems to be about movement of and desire for radical-rooted individualism that is enclosed, that physical pain and bodily sickness and wounding would come to do the work of making oneself complete and perfectible as an enclosed subject. Does that make sense? And I don't know, that just bothers me because I used to frequent Adam for Adam, and I keep going on Grindr and Jack'd and other shit like that, and keep reading people saying things like they want no fats, no femmes. What they're asserting is that there is a certain body that is considered to be normal, and for those that are considered to be abject, they occupy a kind of categorical distinction. And for a long time, I've been thinking about how no fats, no femmes rehearses a kind of theological and philosophical conception of the flesh, a kind of denouncing of its capacity to hold, its capacity to be exorbitant. It's like we're supposed to literally hold our breath in order to be more perfectible, to inhale and hold so that we may appear to be thinner, inhale and hold so as not to be considered out of control. And I think about walking down the street or up the stairs or hills and how that makes me entirely out of breath, how walking, how movement itself can bespeak something of breathing. With no fats, no femmes, the individual is considered to have failed to conform to accepted and acceptable religious doctrine and secular rhetoric. Not only are you queer and thus a kind of repository for sinfulness, but also the appetite is considered to be out of control too. It seems to me to be the case that, similar to the Black Christian rhetorics and theologies, it appears that the flesh is the nadir in the Black queer masculine desiring culture, and that particularly not only for cisgender dudes, but also particularly for them. Because the flesh is the site, the ground zero, upon which religious meaning is made and transforms one into a body that has value. It seems that Black queer masculine desiring people take up the flesh as the site for rupturing normativities and for the creation of their own meaning. They reproduce the theological, philosophical as a kind of category. It is not removed from Christianized concepts, but the deep entrenchment of the idea of Christianity. No Fats, No Femmes seems to be a rhetorical admission to and underscoring of the ways gender performance, as well as the physical musculature of the body, are ripe with social and sacred meaning. Similar to Black queerness and a Black Christian imagination, fat and femme bodies intimate that one is out of control and given to excess. It is a different rendering of a sinful body, yet equally engaged in the discourse of pleasure, ecstasy, and the behaviors of the non-normative. Whereas the normative theologies of the body and sexuality, and certainly within institutional historical Black church culture, there's much focus on the sexual appetites of the congregants. But in the purported regressive space of Black queer culture, there's a focus on the physical appetite and how that affects and produces a body that can be devalued. Fat and femme bodies displace the Black church's regulatory control of the libidinal drive and replace it with a new paradigm towards which Black queer folks must aspire in order to be holy and acceptable. The rational and controlled physical body that has six-pack abs and performs masculinity. All this to say, I wonder about the mortification of a flesh as the means to attempting an ideal of the religious, the spiritual, the set apart, the way mortification in order to have an experience of God. Because what about those of us that are mortified, that are abject to a normative understanding of the flesh? What of those of us that breathe heavy when we walk down the street? What of those of us that experience life itself as a kind of tripart that Julian describes as desiring? What of those of us, in other words, that do not have to become or be initiated into such an experience of bodily pain, but experience it as the ground of our being? This is not to say I want to caution that blackness or queerness is itself a painful experience. It's just to mark that the relation Blackness and queerness has to the normative is through the already distanced abjection that folks like Julian desired. What if we dispense with and discarded altogether the normative ideal? What would then be the experience of the mystical? I guess I'm wondering out loud. A. Dear Moth, I was driving and the random shuffle played Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, Movement 11, and it was the first time I heard it in a long time. It was so moving, the cello especially, when the sound comes in and how it sort of gives a grounding, how it sort of gives the movement grounding, that I listened to the entire album and song as if for the first time. And I've got to say, playing the entire thing and arriving at Movement 11 made me tear up in the car. It was a particularly long drive. The entire song is about movement, about incremental change and difference. So you end up wondering how you got from the first set of pulses to the last set of pulses. Between here and there, between now and then, were worlds of sonic possibility. It could have been otherwise. It's as if I slipped into a crack the size of a neutrino, and as I kept falling in, I experienced the expanse as the experience beyond of space-time, a beyond that is not predicated on but fundamentally an alternative to Newtonian physics and the conceptual linearity of time, the conceptual smoothness of space. The piece is based on an 11-chord cycle, and each movement is a reworking of the rhythmic pulse and harmonics of this 11-chord cycle. Limiting himself to this constraint, Steve Reich and his ensemble produce worlds of sonic inhabitation that vibrate out and produce feeling. Limit, Nahum Chandler would say, was also possibility. Impossible for it to not be possibility. I felt finally prepared to hear what was in Steve Reich because I'd been thinking and talking and really feeling Black Pentecostal music so much more, even when it doesn't emerge from Black Pentecostal churches, like the performance of Mount Dewell Baptist Church and their singing of He Set Me Free, a friend sent me on YouTube, or from YouTube. And this is how it ends. Listen to the way the song incrementally increases in intensity and density in space, increases in tempo and velocity and haste. It moves, it's moving. But there is never a moment when it is decided that some now is the moment to increase in any of those things. It just happens, it just builds. It constructs itself by drawing to itself feeling. And this construction is released through a collective practice and process. They feel their way into the moment by moment change. It moves while it is moving, it's moving while it moves. Being held in the caress and embrace of their choreosonic centrifugative sounding out, their singing. It feels so good. It's like what Nathaniel Mackey says about dreams, how one doesn't really know how one moves from scene to scene. One just ends up in the middle of them, sort of abruptly, in the middle of two scenes at once. The two scenes are really then a doubling, and if double, always then more than a double. If doubled, then a continuous unfolding of plurality. The abruptness in He Set Me Free is measured by how the one man stands and stomps, by how the woman stands and claps and spins and sits, all in one sort of fluid, non-divisional mood and movement, by how the other woman sort of wiggles her arms in the seat, and such wiggling that seems to emerge from her arms ends up moving through and quickening all her flesh, until she stands and enters into an almost choreographic battle with the other man. These abrupt movements weren't planned but happened, weren't planned but announced an entanglement in the congregation, a different kind of shouting. Abrupt changes through incrementalism when division between is imperceptible but happens. That's how it feels listening to Steve Reich or listening to Mount Dewell Baptist Church. It's a mysticism, a Black mysticism, a mysticism that requires the renunciation of the one in favor of becoming plural, or not really becoming, but acknowledging the plurality that is the grounds of our existence. Music, Steve Reich announces, is for 18 musicians. The singing at Mount Dewell Baptist Church is a collective improvisational project. They retreat into rather than away from the social, into rather than away from the dense folds of secreted sound. It seems like an incessant, restive, ongoing refusal to be alone, such that the categorical distinction between alone and lonely evaporates away. They have a feel for this thing. And I've been thinking lately that trying to argue about doctrine and theology is important, but the Black church is so much about feeling. How is it that a place at Mount Dewell can have all this good feeling, but can also be a place from which emerges sexism and homophobia, for example, and what Moya Bailey and Trudy talk about as misogynoir even? How can a place that feels good also be a place that hurts our feelings? And I think we have to talk about hurt feelings in clear and precise ways. Doctrine and theology mark a certain epistemology, but it seems Blackness is one of feeling not against thought, but feeling as thought. This is not an anti-intellectual argument. I keep thinking about this quote from the introduction of Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. Quote, "The white Western patriarchal ordering of things requires that we believe there is an inherent conflict between what we feel and what we think, between poetry and theory. We are easier to control when one part of ourselves is split from another, fragmented, off balance. There are other configurations, however, other ways of experiencing the world, though they are often difficult to name. We can sense them and seek their articulation," end quote. Listening to them sing, I want to stand and shout with them too. I want to let go, release, be free. I feel them. What they feel, I feel it in me. But I also have a sort of anxiety about church because I also feel hella Black queer and different and dissident and distant from the doctrine and theologies of my upbringing. And because of this, church makes me feel hella excluded. It makes me feel all kinds of things, in other words. Heartbreaking in the most robust sense. Broken open that allows for feeling and sensing and mood, but also broken through melancholy and mourning and now a relinquished life. And feeling lonely, feeling alone, wanting connection, feeling hurt because of the inequity produced in a place and a sound that feels so good and inviting and invitational and warm. These complex and often contradictory feelings are all about ways of existence that let feeling flourish as the grounds for experience. And being between, slipping into a crack the size of a neutrino, and experiencing worlds of affective encounter is also about the unfolding of feeling, the flourishing of mood. Can Black study do this sort of thing? Let me know. A. Dear Moth, it's been some time, I know. It took me a while, but I was looking over things I'd written in my sent box and figured I should tell you that I started painting, or really, attempting to make art again. Remember when I showed you the paintings I'd make when I was just a kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old, when I had dreams of becoming a black Bob Ross, afro and all? And remember how I told you my father had a couple of the paintings in his office when I was young, and you said that you wanted them too? I really just thought you were being kind, and him too, really, to offer such a thing. I don't think much of what I painted then, but I'm back into it now. I still remember it being so sweet to want to bring them home with you so that you could, you'd said, constantly be reminded that I was someone's child, that I belonged to my parents, that I was at one time in a high chair needing to be fed and struggling on floors attempting to tie shoes, and a child who cried a lot. It was this toddler that would become the child that attempted to paint, to make worlds he'd never seen except for on The Joy of Painting. You said then that the paintings reminded you of the fact that we all come from someplace, that we all have dreams and ideas and goals, even when we are young, even when they don't necessarily turn out the way we thought. And I definitely could not have anticipated the life that I have now, then. Anyway, I started this art making process, though it's not that good. Been recording the entire process actually with my computer and sometimes my phone. I've been using my apartment, getting paint all over the place, but it makes me feel alive to get this color on the walls and on the floor and have to scrub myself with various kinds of soap to remove oil paint and acrylic ink and watercolors. It's been fun. Explorations in color and movement, they're abstract. But when I told my friend Sophia about the process and showed her some of the work, she said it, and I said it's not about landscapes, she disagreed with me. Quote, I don't agree that your painting isn't, I don't agree. I think your paintings are totally about landscapes. Yes, it's abstract, but it's all about space and moving through space, and so it is about landscape, just not about the property owner's gaze and observing the landscape within the laws of perspective, okay? It's absolutely not about the Western tradition of landscape painting, but it still is about landscapes because it's about inhabiting a space, the space of your apartment where you paint. It's the landscape painting from the inside. This makes me think about marronage and the relationship to land, not looking at landscapes as what can I do to own this land, but rather, can I shelter there? Can I get in there? Can I stay there for a while? End quote. She got what I was attempting to do, so I wanted to share with you. It's not my first time I've attempted since I was a kid, so it's my first time attempting since I was a kid, so it's been an interesting process. But Sophia was so precise to name it that I'm attempting a way to shelter, to find refuge in the practice, to escape in the social world I left behind as it left me excluded. I was inspired by this video. Desiree sent me of a little girl making art in her home. She was covered in paint, had it all over this large room, splattered on her tights and dress, in her hair, on the floor, and the walls. It was mosaic. The comments on YouTube were full of people saying things like, my kid could do that too, or this really isn't art, she's just a child, which is just sad. I was moved by her intentionality, and sure, she's a child, but aren't we all? And sure, she's young, but that doesn't mean she can't make choices about color and mood. Desiree sent me this video not hours after I'd been sitting in my office, having another one of those moments of deep nostalgia, crying while listening to praise breaks I found on YouTube. Something in the music and in the clapping and stomping and in the shouts and orations, something in the sounds made me sit weakened, almost with no energy, so the tears just flowed. So I was already open and vulnerable. Then she sent me this video of the little girl making art, and it was in the middle of the video when she had all this blue paint on her hands, when she was bent over and began to clap them lightly. That blue paint splattered over the canvas spread on the floor. I don't know if I can convey how much that very simple, nuanced, barely there movement hit me with so much force, but it did. It felt like the heavens opened and I heard the cello bass notes and a choir of breathy sopranos and altos singing, like movement 8 of Music for 18 Musicians all over again. I was stunned, but also deeply moved. Clapping, who knew it could do such a thing? Who knew it could make something alongside an otherwise than sound? I wanted to run around the apartment as if I were in church. I definitely was getting happy, as the saints would say, but instead I hopped on the computer and began ordering paint, brushes, canvases, paper, anything. I had an inkling of an idea that I needed to get moving as quickly as possible. The supplies I ordered arrived a couple of days later: bottles of blue, purple, green, yellow, and red acrylic paint, muted ink colors, oil paint too, old socks I never wore anymore, and my laptop in hand, I placed canvas on the floor, plugged up the laptop, and began to play all these testimony service songs and shouting music. Then I stopped. It was moving too quickly. I needed to see something first, needed to start with something much less drastic, much less involved. So I experimented. Like the little girl, I wanted to see what it would look like to clap my hands with paint on them, to see what the paint would do when it fell on the surface. I took a big brush, dipped it in water, and whipped the brush over the paper and let the water fly on the surface at random intervals. I wanted the water to approach something like the creation of its own path. What I was really after was a way to think the fleshliness of the practice of clapping, how it, in Black Pentecostal praise at least, can get sweaty, how the flesh heats and attempts to cool itself. So the random arrays of water lines and passages allowed me to think about and approach something like the wetness and moisture of sweat. I then took muted green and black acrylic ink, poured it in my hands, and began to clap lightly. I wanted to see what the color would do once it found its meeting with the water. I wanted the paint to be carried in the air to the water. And it made all these patterns and splotches. Seeing the splotches, the black and green, and how it sort of fades out towards the edges, how the color becomes less opaque and more transparent towards the corners, how the color deepens in the foreground. I took the next couple of days off and made several hand clapping experiments. So this is another one. Paint got all over the place, not just on the paper, as you can see, but also on the walls, on the wooden floor, on my gray kitchen cabinets, on the refrigerator. Landlord was not pleased. It was a lovely, delightful mess. I couldn't be happier. Eventually, I felt prepared to challenge myself with shouting, dancing. My wooden floors would have to adjust to being messy because there was no way around making everything soiled with paint color. I'm trying to skip around. As luck would have it, I was able to find a song that I downloaded from YouTube, a church in Baltimore, a clip of Bishop Robert Evans talking about dancing in one spot, and it made me really think about the sort of refusal of tightness as constraint in the Black radical tradition, a kind of mysticism of movement that takes constraint as impure possibility, that takes constraint as occasion, constraint as expanse.
I'm going to tell you something else. I'm going to tell you something else you may not know about. But I learned years ago, I grew up in Pentecost, and years ago we had very, very small churches and storefront places, and you would find most of the time them crowded. And you know, like folks run there and run all around the church and run the aisle. I learned when I came up, I learned how to dance in one spot. Wasn't a whole lot of room to even kick your leg and cut up. Amen. You just learned to dance in one spot. And you know what? It's crowded in here, but I just feel like I just want to dance.
In the clip, voices of small yelps and hollers with the pronounced sound of the Hammond organ and the drums let me imagine kids laughing and jumping up and down because their mothers were shouting and not paying attention to them, where the men would say, "Hoo," loudly. He talked about storefront churches as places where praise happened, but because of the tight compression of flesh and not large space, people had to find a spot on the rug or the wooden floor and just go at it. Dancing in one spot is a kind of expansion of compression through praise, through the movement of the flesh. So I poured paint on the canvas floor, and I began to dance, began to shout as if I were in church with them. My eyes were closed, my mouth was frowned, lips were flattened out. I was moving to the rhythm 1, 2, 3, dip, 1, 2, 3, dip. It was the loudness of it that allowed me to get lost in the sound, in their posture and posing. It was the loudness of the music that broke me out of my thinking too much about it just momentarily enough to open out into something else. I kind of put my head down and smiled to myself, but after I smiled, I closed my eyes again and began listening to the people praising, to the drums, to the Hammond organ, creating sonic distance between the bass pedals and the use of the notes in the highest register with all the drawbars pulled out. And it happened, something happened. When things got too sticky, I got more paint, poured it in the tray, stepped in it, and recommenced shouting. After I opened my eyes, I saw reds and blues and the breakthrough of purples in various intensities. Depending on how hard and where I danced, how much I mixed and quite literally scratched the canvas with old new colors. I opened my eyes, tired and sweaty, feeling as if I'd touched some otherwise, as if I'd worshiped even while maintaining disbelief as to why and to what people often say they worship in the first place. I discovered something in the movement itself, something that could not be contained by a confession of faith, something that is not merely transcendent, but that is most fundamentally constitutive and immanent. Upon opening my eyes, the canvas had a few splotches of color here and there, but it was still far too empty. One person simply can't do the kind of spiritual, material thing alone. So I've been practicing by myself a lot lately with all sorts of paint, but I'm hoping to invite others to play along, to recreate a church service where the residue of such sociality will be the colors that we leave behind. Residue. That's the word for it, a kind of remainder, an excess that cannot be explained or explained away. Residue kind of names an excess that is experienced or gained at the moment when the mode of shouting and clapping is sort of unconscious or maybe aconscious. Weird thing is, if consciousness were all about the thing in our brains manufactured and it was experienced differently for each of us, if our realities were all a dream that was ephemeral and would wither away at a moment's notice, that still would not answer the question of why it exists or how it came to be. What would ephemera or a dream be in such a case? If it were manufactured, we still wouldn't understand the sensations created. If a dream, why do we have it? If we had scientific explanations for life, that would still not explain why it is that we feel love, joy, and heartache and sadness. What to explanation is happiness experienced, butterflies endured, elation given and withheld as so many breaths. Even if we could explain it all, we would not know what it means. There is something in the gift of life that exceeds enclosures of logic, of science, of explanation, of analytics, and that excess and residue is a gift. It is a gift that doesn't seek to explain as much as it seeks to experience. It's not so much about the product, though I do hope that the series waiting to be created, will be considered beautiful and moving. The fundamental force of it is the experience, the movement, the verve, the fact that it happened, it happens, and it will happen. I've said all that to say the little girl quickened in me the notion that even clapping or even shouting contains within it the potential for the thing we call art. Such movement simply needs the work energy to convert it. Her clapped hands with blue paint made me want to see what it would look like, what the sort of Black Pentecostal praise I love would splatter on the ground and upon the walls. I wanted to see what praise looks like after the flesh, the material force of such creation, left the building, after the flesh escaped. Would I be able to look at the canvases and paper or whatever other surface chosen and see something of such gathering, of spirit, by spirit, for spirit? I chuckle a bit after I'm done with the experiments because it brings me a kind of unconscious or perhaps aconscious joy. But I'm also becoming more adept with color mixing, and I'm getting my good breathing back too, which means I've convinced myself that maybe there might be something to this experimentation in color and in song after all. Let me know what you think. And so this is an example, ooh, that's big. This is an example of me dancing. You can't hear it, but I have headphones on and I'm listening to one of the praise breaks and I'm dancing on paper with pigment powder, which I explained earlier I learned was really dangerous to do because pigment powder is made of mostly metal. And I just didn't know. But this is an example of using pigment powder and not paint. And this is what it looks like with pigment powder. And then another pigment powder example. And then one more. I'm going to skip that letter because I don't want to belabor the point. Dear Moth, I guess you could say quantum theory and mysticism and loneliness are about, for me at least, explorations into the possibilities for deep and capacious and abiding interconnection. Loneliness isn't about the connection. loneliness isn't about that connection, but about trying to figure out the shit that gets in the way of such possibility. One thing I love about the movie Moonlight is that the film never resolves exactly why the character Terrell antagonized Chiron so much. It never attempts to psychologize or analyze him. Some think maybe he was a closet gay, or maybe jealous of Chiron's relationship with Kevin, or maybe he was just a terrible person. I appreciate the film for not resolving or really even exploring this, because it doesn't matter. What mattered was the impact such antagonism had on little then Chiron, then black, or little then black then Chiron. What mattered is that Chiron continually berated. What mattered is that Chiron was continually berated and belittled and made to feel that he didn't belong in the world by someone. When we rush to psychologize, which really pathologizes why someone behaves the way that they do, rather than linger with the impact of such behavior and what the behavior has on a target, we end up making sensual what they've done, and we figure out ways to explain it and explain it away. And I kind of want to remain with the impact more. I'm feeling this particularly because I'm sensitive to how you're saying the dude. So there's a letter where I explain this dude who's terrible. Sorry, that's all I can say. I'm feeling this particularly because I'm sensitive to how you're saying the dude could have been lonely as the reason he both drew near to me and withdrew from me. That he may or may not feel sadness because of the church, and that perhaps his homophobic rant, his desire for distance, is because he's confused, that he is perhaps experiencing loneliness, and that is the reason he would say such things. But listen, I've been lonely sometimes, very much still today. And you know this. I came out the closet thinking would make available to me the possibility for relationship and dating, though that simply has not been the case. I failed utterly with an erotic life. In all my years, and you know this, except for you, I've been single. And much of what we had was undefined, and I know that's my fault, so I don't even consider that. I've dated here and there, but I'm just alone right now, no relationship to speak of, really. And I ain't saying this to be mean. What we had, what we have, whatever it is beautiful. But first, I kept fighting you and the pull you had on me, and now you keep fighting me and the pull I have on you. So it doesn't make sense to even say that it's been successful, this you and I. It has been so much frustration for me because there's so much I want to give to you and be with and for you, but you have these ideas about how you want to occupy the world. You're doing the very thing I think is a problem, escaping from the social to be alone. And I don't want to relegate whatever it is that we have and say that it's unimportant, that friendship is of no consequence. But I'm a victim of patriarchy too. I keep saying I need more when really I don't. I'm not sure. I try to figure out my own impulses of relationship as ownership and as property relations. It's so difficult, though, to relinquish the hold and grip on that idea because then I'd have even less, or maybe that's what I presume. I'm trying to figure things out, but I'm really lonely. What I do know is that it is not an erotic life, an intimate relational life that has sustained my ability to remain, to have joy, to have peace of mind. Or really, the intimacy that has sustained me isn't normative at all. It's a queer intimacy, the intimacy of close sitting and held breath, of sharing thoughts and ideas and laughter. There has been loneliness and sadness on both sides of the closet, on both sides of attempting to speak more precisely about who I am without fear or shame or loathing. Loneliness, then, cannot be a reason that I accept for others to say shit that is violent and dangerous. I'd been lonely as a kid and teenager trying to figure out my relation to the church and life and love. I knew I was attracted to men, but also felt deeply that I needed to connect with God, that I needed to change, that I was vile and sinful and terrible. I prayed and cried and searched and read scripture for connection to all that was holy, even when I felt the most connected to what I thought God to be. What I mean is, even when I was supposedly saved, I felt distance from God and all things holy. No amount of church going changed that loneliness. I went to church, all the time, but I have not been altogether honest. You are not the only one that has tried asceticism, that has tried to renounce the world and the flesh for something higher and different and other. For a very long time, I thought I was to be celibate, thought my life was some sort of sacrificial example of how to move through the world without wanting, without desiring. Or not really not wanting nor desiring, but channeling want and desire into the direction of something bigger and higher than myself. Because I really did believe that I was a fallen creature, that my existence itself was of fallenness. I tried to quiet the disquieting noise of queerness I felt reverberating in me, a kind of queerness that made me open and vulnerable and feminine and not boyish, a kind of noise of the non-normative. And the attempts to quiet this noise put me on a pursuit for God, yes. You know that I wanted to be a preacher, but do you know that I seriously considered Catholic priesthood because of celibacy as a way of life? I don't talk about that time of my life much because it is so difficult to recount. I was very conservative, would tell folks that they were hell-bound for being queer, would tell myself most intensely of it all. I remember when the college choir was asked to sing for an event for the yearly LGBTQ celebration week, and I said to the choir's executive board, since I was the director, under no uncertain terms would we sing for them. We, in quotes, don't give them, quote, the impression that we are okay with their sinfulness is what I said to them, and I was serious. The executive board argued with me, yes, but in the end, I persuaded them and we didn't sing. If I try to recount the kind of faces they made at me, it was likely because they were thinking, this gay-ass motherfucker, or something similar. It really happened, y'all. But though contradictory, I'd go home, get on AOL and chat or call the party line and have someone come over late at night. I was still convicted that queer shit was sin shit. And I was convinced above all of my own need to reform lest I be hellbound. So maybe I was all into telling other folks about hell as an end because I was hoping to prove to God that I could be serious about my purported calling, that I could really be true and honest and pure, and that I was serious about sacrificing all the shit I felt in order to be saved. And it seemed like Catholic priests, even though I knew so little of Catholicism, had done so much to control their flesh, and I knew I needed a way too. And in parentheses it says, and I have a much more thorough understanding of Catholicism today, so I'm not casting aspersions on this tradition. I'm just telling you what I thought about things then, in parentheses. So I started attending St. Martin de Porres Church on Lehigh Avenue in Philadelphia, would go there for Sunday Mass, and I'd leave there and go to Open Door Mission True Light Church in West Philadelphia. I'd arrive at Open Door late, of course, but because service went from 11:30 to about 2 or 3 p.m., it didn't matter. I sat in the balcony at Open Door, wanted to be as anonymous as possible. There were very different kinds of churches in many ways, but very Black in similar ways too. One Black Catholic, the other Black Pentecostal. One male priest, the other Black female pastor. Anyway, I went to Open Door because it connected me to what I knew, but St. Martin de Porres I attended because I was seeking seriously another path and direction. I began talking to the priest there, going to confession and everything, hoping to get rid of what I kept feeling and desiring against desiring. What I kept dreaming for, even though they were like nightmares. I tried to escape, was serious about the priesthood, so no, you're not the only one that's doing the thing you're doing now. I read scripture daily, prayed the stations, lamented and praised, cried and wailed. I tried to perform what it meant to do this serious sort of thing ascetics did. I wanted to retreat into my personal desert, retreat into my own catacomb. Maybe then, alone and in solitude, I'd find God and love him and do what was required and would be sheltered from my longing and desire for men. And I thought I'd be finally united with someone, with God, and that would make me feel better about the world. And then sometime later, I met you. And then sometime later, that smile. Anyway, I guess I'm figuring out all over again that my search for connection with God did not dissipate the loneliness, that the aloneness I felt was a kind of isolation from the world, from worlds, that isolation made me desire connection that always felt and still feels today thwarted. I suppose there are differences between loneliness and aloneness and isolation that I'm still attempting to figure out. What I do know is that I didn't have to go into deserts or retreat from the world. I'd prayed alone and cried there so much alone for a change to come, for relief and for reprieve. And it wasn't until I met you that I felt what I came to later read about and consider entanglement to be. My life and the way I have attempted to live it has meant choosing Black queerness, even if that at the same time has meant choosing loneliness all over again. Loneliness all over again. Skipping. Anyway, dude doesn't get a pass, even if he is lonely and his weirdness, his rudeness, his distance is grounded in disbelief that something beautiful could come from thinking more intentionally about me. And so I want to hold off the space to say that my choosing loneliness because of the lack of erotic relationship doesn't seem to be the same sort of choosing of mystical experience of the individual or of individuation of the subject or something. And maybe I need to say I haven't chosen loneliness at all, but the possibility for an alternative to community. So many folks I've met and loved and cherished because of choosing this sociality of queerness. You, of course, included, but I'm rambling. A, and promise the last letter. Dear Moth, there are worlds, and the fact of our experiencing them is because we are impossibly vulnerable and open as a way of life. The central nervous system isn't enclosed in the borders of the so-called body, but it's out there in worlds. That which is central is kind of ecstatic force, ecstatic being, existence beside or otherwise than the thing we call the self. Such that the idea of an outside and inside needs to be thought against. Maybe entanglement, maybe a system. That's why I talk about flesh instead of a body, because for me at least, flesh names this kind of openness, this necessary vulnerability. It's been a while since I've heard from you. You sent that text when you returned home that you shouldn't have come over, that you're sorry you cried, that you love me but you can't. And all this talk mostly about God. And it's taken me some time to think about what you wrote. I had to think about it, and this is what I think. Here. What quantum physics is discovering is a redefinition of space-time as not linear nor separable. If this is the case and God is, as you say, an unfolding, then this God would also be the unfolding of all that is and is not textual, able to be detected by our finite capacities. This would mean that there is something that is behind or withdraws from even the quantum understanding of space-time, some other sort of relation, some other sort of unity and convergence that would undo even the concepts of unity, convergence, together, sociality, unfolding, enfolding, undoing, doing, action, reaction. Does this make sense? And that would then mean love too, right? Because don't we think of love as the unfolding of possibility in time and space, or following quantum mechanics in space-time? Love is approaching a kind of sociality of experience. But then maybe also love would be that which necessarily withdraws through the approach, the very possibility of possibility. Because what does it mean for something or nothing to be of, from, or marking relation to possibility if it recedes from sense experience? Love as the sense experience beyond sensuality, beyond or withdrawing from or below or sharing some other kind of relation to experience. It's like what Fred Moten says to Wu Sang in Conversation, quote, "The first time I heard the sound of your voice, it filled me with a sense of future perfect, the friendship I will have had, getting to know you, sounding without you, walking, just walking and heart beating, out of sync but in time," end quote. To be filled with a sense, and for that sense to be the future perfect means that the voice was the point of departure for excess. It exceeded the very possibility of delimitation, was its own enactment of otherwise possibility, was a rip in space-time linearity. And that's how it is, or that's how it was and is with you too. We exist in and as excess, as that which cannot be contained or engulfed or enclosed by anything, negation or exclusion included. It's as if we are the flesh of what quantum mechanics is discovering. What I'm trying to say imprecisely is this: I think I love you, ? I watched the movie An Oversimplification of Her Beauty a lot, as you know, and I get why she sent the text message she did, why it was a question but was also a statement, how it was tentative but also very sure. I think I love you. I understand because you, Moth, make me feel what I've just been afraid to say but know to be true. I have never felt this way about anyone, in my life before. And that sounds like a platitude, but what I mean is this: you are, and my feeling for you is black noise, is static. It's sort of the background against everything I do occurs. I don't consciously think about you all the time, no, but I feel you when I sleep, when I wake, when I cook, when I sing, as I breathe, as I breathe, as I breathe, it's you. A sort of quiet omnipresence, a soft enclosement. You are the noise, almost chant-like, I hear sort of far off in the deepest recesses and furthest reaches of my flesh. And yet you feel more than near, closer than anything I've ever known. I do not think about you as much as I think you. It's as if you are bound to each thought, whatever that thought might be that I think. It's as if you are the ground of all that is. It's as if you are the ground of all that is for me. I don't mean this in a pathological way or that I cannot exist without you, that I have a weird sort of codependence that is more about ego and narcissism than about your well-being or mine. I just mean that I desire you and I feel that we are one. It's like what I said to you in the text message not soon after meeting you. It's as if in and with you, I'd found the voice in my head to which I was constantly searching, the voice in my head to which I was constantly replying, as if meeting you confirmed that we already were, that we already was, as if meeting you were the promise and the fulfillment of a promise, a breakdown of simultaneity through a space-time rip or tear or break. I understand David and Jonathan being knit together. Quote, unlike weaving, knitting does not require a large loom or other large equipment, making it a valuable technique for nomadic and non-agrarian peoples, end quote. David and Jonathan were knit together and were movers, nomadic. Nomads are wanderers, and I'm thinking about David's 23rd Psalm, talking about walking through the valley of the shadow of death but not fearing, wandering in death's shadow but still feeling assured. And though this 23rd is about the Lord, I wonder if it's also about what had been backgrounded, David's being knotted up and tangled with Jonathan. And what I mean is this, I think I love you, no question mark. And what I mean is this, I have not stopped telling everyone about you, the joy you have brought and continue to bring me. And what I mean is this, there is not only you in the world, but you are my paraclete, and I yours. And what I mean is this, I want a consensuality with you, a continued consent to be together, a way of life that will always have friendship as the first and always plural operation. And what I mean is this, entanglement might be the best way to approach what I feel, that once joined together, we are a system. We maintain our uniqueness regardless of nearness or farness, regardless of space-time separation. We are indivisible. We renounce the individual for the social, for and with and in each other. And what I mean is this, it's as if dream worlds were hallucinating otherwise universes as possible, and my and your dream world outpoured towards each other, enfolded into and collapsed within one another. And what I mean is this, it's kind of beautiful, but mostly scary, because I don't know what this means and haven't since I first met you, and am unsure what to do. I do not want to control you. Your consent is more necessary than my desire. I'm not just speaking metaphorically. I want to be touched by and touch you continually. I'm not talking about some abstract kind of affection, but a real feeling of and with and in you, and reciprocally. Love is a material thing. It breaks open imagination and makes possible other ways of conceiving what we can think and do and be. Until the space-time beyond when where I never feel you, which will never be. A. Thank you. Oh yeah, I'm done. So I think there'll be Q&A if you all have any questions or comments, or that didn't make any sense, or whatever.
And I'll let you can moderate it if you want, or I can help you, but.
Unless there are no questions. Okay. Hi. Yes, you, please. Front, second row. Wait, yeah.
Okay, I think there's a difference between one hand clapping and two hands clapping. Mm-hmm. And I think your narrative goes to that. That is to say that there's a kind of detachment with one hand clapping that you can achieve that kind of enlightenment that Moth is going after. But when you have two hands clapping, it's the expression that you have a partner. Mm-hmm. That the other hand is that partner. And it does have all these repercussions that you go to another stage of your life, mm-hmm. you know, from discovering who you are to discovering who your partner is. Just to give it a entomology, I call it going from existential to sexistential.
Okay.
And I think that's what I took from your description of this narrative. But there's more, you know, that follows that, which is what I call nextistential, mm-hmm. which means you get up on a podium and you start telling people about it so that they learn and their consciousness is expanded and they become your students. Mm-hmm. And I take it that's the stage you've now achieved here.
Well, thank you. 'Cause, I mean, it's kind of, it's fictionalized in some ways intentionally to protect people who are real, and those very real experiences, but tries to capture something of the real feeling that emerged from very real experiences. And that existential part, the sharing of it publicly is really scary. I mean, because it is so much about sharing very real experiences of loneliness and heartbreak with church and heartbreak with people, and but also trying to say that the heartbreak isn't all that has been experienced, the loneliness isn't all that's been experienced, and can we share in even the explication of or the elaboration of a certain kind of loneliness as a social practice in order to be further connected to more people. And so it is about trying to link that existential with the sexistential, with the nexistential. It's trying to really say that we each in our lives, I think, probably experience modes of aloneness and loneliness. And how can we think about who we are as people and the conditions that create the occasion for us to think of ourselves as alone and lonely? And can we use that as a liberatory project against the very possibility for being lonely and alone? It's something that I'm really trying to think about. So sharing it with the public is scary, but I think a necessary component of that ethical project that I'm trying to engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It was very vulnerable, and also your presentation this morning or this afternoon that I was at. I think the transparency in your process, like artistically, theoretically, and personally, it's really a gift. So thank you for that. And, my question, I'm going to think out loud a little bit, but as I mentioned, I'm really interested in a notion of a kind of or a reframing of ideas of relinquishment as erratic, or the potential like eros in those actions. And so I was noticing how much you said relinquishment and renunciation or renounce in your reading, and sometimes those had sort of those sounded like acts that come at a cost to one's wellness or wholeness or something. And other times you spoke them at a moment of like a letting in. And I'm curious if you just have any thoughts on that kind of, that juxtaposition of this letting go or giving up, and how dual that can be, or multiple that can be.
Yeah, I think of one of the things I'm trying to make clear in another project that I'm working on is that I think of white supremacy as renouncing relation. And so in some ways, one of the things I want to think deeply about is what renunciation does, or what relinquishing does. What does relinquishing relation, what does renouncing relation as sort of the ground for the possibility of the thing we call like a self or an individual or modern man, that we are or white supremacy is the intentional practice of refusing relation in the service of a political and economic project of capitalist exploitation. I'm going to give you my children to take care of, and I'm going to force you to take care of them in the antebellum period, for example. I'm going to force this enslaved Black woman to take care of the person that I birthed. I'm renouncing my relationship in the service of this political, economic, and legal arrangement. So I'm forcing you to actually practice care because I'm renouncing my relation to care. And so in some ways, the thing that I'm trying to sort of really think about and interrogate is that practice of renunciation, while at the same time also thinking about other modes of renunciation or refusing to renounce relation as a different kind of liberatory practice. Trying to think about relinquishing normative ideology about what it means to be a sexual individual, relinquishing or renouncing church ideology about sin and sexuality. That mode of renunciation allows for the opening up toward a further, greater, deeper, more dense experience of the social world. And that is in the opposite direction of a sort of renunciatory project that is about the retreat from the social world. And so I'm trying to think about renunciation in its fullness, the capacity for it to hold those plural directions, that it can go in the direction of a justice project or it can go in the direction of a deeply violent political economic project. It's how we are intentioning the practice. And so for me, I want to think with, imagine with, try to experience with modes of traditions and persons who have renounced in the service of a deeply social practice, as opposed to those who renounce in the service of a deeply sort of individual pietistic practice. That, because I think of the deeply social practice as the practice of a different kind of piety, like a sort of social, collective, improvisational piety that can never be about the ownership of one's personal pious disposition, but about the creation of a social space in which one is caring about practicing care with and love with one another as sort of the grounds of existence. So that's kind of the at least two directions in which I'm thinking renunciation and relinquishment, but more to come to, I think. Thank you.
So, and this might just be a reflection of my perception, so take it with a grain of salt, but throughout the whole delivery of these, the wording is very precise and very clinical in certain cases. But then throughout, there are these little pepperings of jargon or slang or just kind of like very colloquial language. Would you say that's more an artifact of the fictionalization of this perspective, or more the reader trying to, or the author trying to convey to the reader what they, have been drawing upon, or even to remind themselves of where it came from? It seems very juxtaposed.
It's how I talk. And that's it's not a flippant response, even though that is the response. That's how I talk, it's how I think, it's how I reflect on the world through, slang isn't slang to me, it's part of the lexicon through which communication happens, just like the precision of, or the seeming precision of certain kinds of theoretical thinkers like Foucault or Heidegger or Kant or whomever we can consider to be a certain kind of precision, is neither more or less precise than the slang that I use when I'm using sort of African-American vernacular English. That is the way that I think my relation to language. So for me, it's not actually code switching, which some people would call it. It is the way that I talk. It is the way that I write everything, to the consternation of a whole lot of editors. But I kind of don't care. Because what I'm also trying to do is practice a certain kind of refusal of propriety that at least certain kinds of academic spaces think you have to do and perform and be to be successful. I kind of don't care about success in the academy. I care deeply about an ethical project of trying to think liberation for the masses. And for me, that means, it's kind of like this theorist and playwright and a whole lot of other things, novelist Sylvia Wynter, talks about using the things that she has at her disposal in the service of a liberatory project. And so for me, I'm trying to marshal all the tools that I've been given, and some of those are like this seemingly clinical, philosophical, and theological language, which I think is only actually ever the veneer of the clinical. It's actually not. That it also is part of the reason why it is considered to be clinical is because it emerges through renouncing its relation to other kinds of languaging. And so for me, I'm not even trying to infuse it back with an other kind of language. For me, I'm just trying to make more apparent the way that my thought happens in various registers. So it's difficult for me to call it fiction, because I don't think of it as fiction, even though there are fictionalized occurrences that are in the sort of manuscript. It is really about the attempt to capture feeling, and feeling for me goes in multiple directions and has a lot of different kinds of language registers through which that moves. You have a follow-up.
So when you say that sort of multiple directions, in the same way that you would posit that you're divorcing the clinical tone from the academic setting, you're also divorcing the colloquial tone from the delivery of a love letter.
I would not say divorce. No. I think what you are raising is important because I think it helps me clarify. I'm not trying to divorce. I'm trying to more say that there has been a historical process of renunciation, of a certain kind of relation between the thing that we consider to be the clinical. Like the clinical is a renunciation of a certain kind of originary or anoriginal non-clinicalness or slangness or vernacular that for me, it's not then about the divorcing of those two things. It's about saying that what has happened is this historical process of the actual, there's like it's like, I see it visually, there's like a filtering out of and the removal of the thing that we call the non-precise from the so-called precise in order to produce the thing called the precise. That the precise is an after effect of the renunciation of that which precedes it, which is the complex imprecision that is already always existing. Or like the concept of the pure is created through the renunciation of the impure that always precedes it. And so for me, it's not about sort of raising or attempting a sort of divorcing as much as trying to really say what has happened is this renunciation process. And I'm trying as much as possible in my practice, in my language, to not engage that renunciation process or that relinquishment process in the service of becoming more precise or in the service of becoming more clinical or in the service of becoming more academic. That I'm trying to resist that sort of imposition. That's what I'm trying to do. Thank you. There was like a hand, yeah.
Towards this, but you spent a very long time talking about how, or the main characters spent a long time talking about how they had a fight within themselves between being queer and that idea of godfulness slash having that faith and knowing that that faith is a core of kind of the Black community. How does that person or you find the ability to find, I guess, peace or a middle ground in which you can exist in both your queerness and your own self as well as be godful slash not sinful?
Yeah, I mean, that's a simple answer. No, I'm joking. It ain't easy. It's Angela Davis has a book titled Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And it's about Palestinian conflict, but I believe it to be true just in general, that it is the attempt to practice something that looks like the thing we call freedom is a practice of every day having to decide that we're gonna do this again. By which I mean it is an intentional decision to say that these doctrines and theologies, which can easily be accepted in quotes, are deeply damaging. And as the psalm says, morning by morning, you have to wake up and say, I have to resist this again. And so for me, it's not about peace, because peace is a sort of, the way that I think about what peace is supposed to name is a sort of lack of conflict. And what I'm interested in is the confrontation. People don't like me. And like folks from my old church don't really fuck with me no more. And I'm okay with that. Like it took a long time to be okay with it. But I'm okay with it because I have joy. And it is not a joy that emerges from cohering with doctrine and theology that fundamentally was making me feel oppressed and marginalized. It is a joy that emerges from existing with community that has recognized that we can celebrate our difference in its fullness. And so because I have joy, the thing that I want to do with people is to practice joy with other folks and to spread joy and to literally have it. And so that's not peace for me, it's joy, or it's the attempt to practice and to live into a joyful disposition, by which I mean not happiness or sadness, but a recognition that there is delight in the world, there is beauty in the world, and that the practices of being marginalized do not take away the capacity to sense that beauty, to sense that delight. And because the practices of marginalization were never enough to take away the capacity for that sense, for that sense experience, joy is possible for me. And it also gives me a certain kind of empathetic posture towards folks who probably don't like me and probably say really bad things about me. Sometimes I'm kind of interested in what the narrative has been said, but mostly I'm not interested because I'm sure it's probably terrible. But I'm living, it seems to me, a life of joy. And it's not an individual life. It's a joy that is made possible through a collective practice. And if there is something like peace that I've achieved, it's been achieved through a collective practice, through recognizing I'm not the only one, through recognizing that there are other people who are also struggling toward something like a more just world. And I think that also emerged when I relinquished an anxiety about personal identity as the fundamental mode through which people must accept me. And when I began to recognize that the problem of the thing we call sexuality or sexual orientation emerges from a political economy of like empire and anti-Black racism and settler colonialism, systems and structures of harm, such that that's why I talk about like gay clubs and no fats, no femmes. It's because even in supposedly liberatory spaces, we end up reproducing the harm against one another because we don't have a decolonial, liberatory abolitionist practice about the political. We have it about sort of personal identity. But the practice of personal identity only gets you so far. And so for me, once I realized it is much deeper than, does the church like me and my gayness? And what does the church have to say about empire? Once that question became the more urgent question for me, it became a lot easier to empathize, and it became easier to like not have anxiety about do people like me or not, because they don't like what I say about Obama either. So like, and even though he keeps saying stuff about, Jeremiah Wright. So like, because those things are like the facts, it just gives a different kind of tenor to, and a different kind of urgency to even my understanding of my personal identity. So I hope that somewhat answers the question. I guess. I don't know if it can, yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been really inspiring to listen to you today.
Thank you.
To watch the many dimensions of your liberatory daily praxis, whether it's embodied movement, sound, YouTube appropriation. It transcends all of those. And your own personal voice, you've used it as a kind of a vessel for letting your soul rise up and connect. And you were talking about tools. I'm wondering, as you move forward in this journey, this creative journey where you're really connecting the creative and the spiritual in all of your praxis, what tools are you wanting to use that you haven't touched yet?
Yeah, I have this. Is everyone familiar with Music for 18 Musicians? A couple of people. And, I want to work with orchestras, but I'm an ear-trained musician, so that's going to be difficult. But my friend says I have a Pentecostal ear, which I think is just true. There are ways that I want to think about orchestral music, like Music for 18 Musicians, and trying to Pentecostalize it. I sense it in my head. I can hear scratches of it in my head. I already know that it's possible because I can kind of sense it. So I want to work with orchestras. and Hammond organs and choirs. In that practice, I want to do more with augmented reality. I've been using augmented reality applications to think a more robust art practice. And I don't know what happens after that, but I think that there will be more that makes itself apparent and available in terms of, I just want to think in as many ways possible the fact that alternatives to the normative exist. And each of the art practices, whether painting or trying to think with music and sound, or writing, it's all in the service of saying that there is a so-called normative world, and then there's all this alternative stuff that's constantly happening in our world. And what if we paid attention to those alternatives? And so I'm just trying to, the thing that I did with augmented reality, I'm also trying to do with fabric. I don't know how to sew yet, but I want to do it with fabric. I want to do it with like glass blocks. Like I want to make versions of the same thing to say that the version of the same teaches us it's a pedagogical strategy for saying that we can always create something different than the thing that supposedly only is. And that through an imagination for plurality, perhaps we can actually think about how to treat each other better. And perhaps we could, like, instead of, using billions of dollars to fund wars, maybe we could use it to like give people health care and to think about equitable education, and education that's not about getting a good job, but education that's about liberation, or education that's about like the joy of, I'm corny, learning is fun. Getting my hands in paint is like the most fun thing I've done ever. Like just making a mess. And I think that that's like what we should be doing. Having a preferential option for messiness is a thing that I'm really interested in trying to do. And so I'm hoping to envision things that I haven't envisioned yet, but there are things that come to me already that I don't know how to do. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do those things, like the orchestra stuff. And then beyond that, letting whatever that orchestra stuff is lead me to something else. I want to do lighting design and sound art too. I have a whole sound art project with the Hammond organ that I have planned, and no money to do it, but I have it planned. And so just trying to do an oral history project with Hammond organists to collect the stories of these church musicians who talk about their modes of transmission and how they've learned from one another. And people are dying, and we're losing these stories that are about alternative forms of pedagogy and alternative forms of sociality. And these musicians who all recognize that churches, the choir is like, I said this earlier, but the choir is imagined to be at least a queer space. And these musicians are figuring out these relationships with choir directors and each other where they are negotiating various understandings of sex and sexuality through music making. And like, this is pedagogical to me. But it's also like living this. And so I want to do things that allow me to think about the complexity of what already is, because the complexity of what already is may perhaps give us a way to think about the complexity of what is to come. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful mess.
I'm a mess.
I can bring you back to a nice place
It's a lovely place.
Stay safe.
Thank you all, I really appreciate it.